The violin music soared high above the chatter in the grand hall. Eleanor adjusted her emerald green wig, the cascade of curls foreign against her skin. The fitted black dress, unlike her usual floral style, clung to her curves like an unapologetic statement. She'd never been to a wedding as a stranger, let alone one disguised to spy on her own fiancé. The bride was radiant, her lace gown glittering under the chandeliers. But Eleanor's eyes weren't on her. They were on him. Daniel. Her Daniel, or at least, that's what she'd thought until 3 days ago when she stumbled upon a series of emails between him and another woman. "I can't wait to spend forever with you," one read, signed by a name she didn't recognize, Sarah. Another attached a receipt for a custom-made engagement ring, purchased a year ago. It wasn't the ring he'd given her. Eleanor had almost fainted when she'd first read those emails, her breath catching in her throat. But she hadn't confronted him. Not yet. She needed answers, and what better place to find them than his second wedding? "Excuse me, miss," a waiter interrupted her thoughts, holding out a tray of champagne flutes. "Would you like one?" She hesitated. "No, thank you." The waiter nodded and moved on. Eleanor turned her attention back to the crowd. She needed to stay sharp. Her plan was simple: observe, gather information, and decide how to blow this entire charade to smithereens. But as her eyes locked on Daniel, laughing with an older man who looked like Sarah's father, the weight of it all hit her. How had she been so blind? The announcer's voice boomed, calling everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, the first dance is husband and wife." The crowd clapped as Daniel led Sarah to the center of the room. Eleanor's heart raced. Her fiancé, no ex-fiancé, was holding another woman in his arms, smiling down at her like she was his entire world. Her fingers curled into fists. She wanted to storm over, grab the microphone, and tell everyone who he really was. But then she caught something odd. Sarah was whispering to him. Her face was tight, her smile forced. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but she could read the tension in their movements. They're not as perfect as they seem. The realization gave her a sliver of satisfaction. She wasn't the only one Daniel had lied to. But why would Sarah go through with the wedding if she knew? Eleanor moved closer, blending into the crowd as she tried to pick up snippets of conversation. Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, scrolling through Daniel's emails with trembling hands. She'd stumbled upon them accidentally while using his laptop to order catering for their wedding. The folder, labeled work receipts, had seemed innocent enough, until it wasn't. She read every word, her disbelief growing with each line. It wasn't just the engagement ring or the sweet nothings he'd written to Sarah. It was the dates. They overlapped. He'd been engaged to Sarah for almost a year, long before he'd proposed to her. Her phone buzzed on the table and Daniel's name lit up the screen. Her stomach churned. She couldn't answer. Not now. She needed time to think. She closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. What was she supposed to do? Cancel their wedding? Confront him? Call Sarah? Each option seemed more terrifying than the last. The music changed and Eleanor snapped back to the moment. Sarah and Daniel had finished their first dance and were now mingling with guests. Eleanor seized her chance, weaving through the crowd until she was close enough to hear their conversation. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Sarah's smile faltered. "We'll talk later." "Sarah." "Later," she hissed, turning away to greet a guest. Eleanor's heart pounded. There was trouble in paradise and she was determined to find out why. Eleanor didn't want to wait for answers to unfold. She had risked everything by coming here, and she wasn't leaving empty-handed. Keeping her distance from Daniel, she followed Sarah instead. The bride moved briskly through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with guests but looking distracted. Her smile was too wide, her laughter strained. Sarah disappeared through a side door. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before following. She found herself in a corridor lined with mirrors and vases of white lilies. Sarah was at the end of it, leaning against the wall and pressing a hand to her temple. Eleanor's breath caught. Should she reveal herself? Before she could decide, Sarah's phone rang. Eleanor ducked into a shadowed alcove. "Hello?" Sarah answered, her voice trembling. Eleanor listened closely. "No, I haven't told him yet," Sarah whispered, pacing. "I don't know how to. He's so sure about this." "About us?" Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. "Told him what?" she wondered. She leaned forward slightly, straining to hear. "Can you stop pressuring me?" "I'm trying to handle it my way," Sarah snapped, then lowered her voice. "Look, I'll tell him after the honeymoon, okay? He doesn't need to know now." Eleanor's heart pounded. What was Sarah hiding? She stayed frozen in place as Sarah ended the call and hurried back to the hall. Eleanor waited a few moments before stepping out, her mind racing. Whatever Sarah was keeping from Daniel, it was big, and Eleanor intended to find out what it was. Eleanor hadn't slept the night she discovered the emails. Instead, she spent hours digging into Sarah's life. It wasn't hard to find her on social media. Sarah had an active Instagram account filled with pictures of sunsets, coffee cups, and snapshots of her with Daniel. Scrolling through, Eleanor felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Sarah seemed so happy, so in love. Did she have any idea what kind of man Daniel really was? One post in particular caught Eleanor's eye. It was a picture of Sarah and Daniel at a restaurant, captioned, "Celebrating our engagement. Can't wait for forever." The date made Eleanor's stomach drop. It was the same weekend Daniel had taken her to the mountains and proposed. She slammed her laptop shut and paced the room. Confronting Daniel felt impossible. How could she even start that conversation? But staying silent wasn't an option either. She needed to face the truth no matter how painful. Eleanor returned to the reception, her thoughts spinning. She couldn't let Sarah's secret distract her from her own goal, exposing Daniel. But as she watched him from across the room, laughing and shaking hands with guests, she realized she needed a new plan. A dramatic reveal might satisfy her anger, but it wouldn't get her the answers she needed. Instead, she decided to play the long game. If Daniel and Sarah had secrets, she would uncover them, quietly. A man's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Haven't seen you around before. Friend of the bride or groom?" Eleanor turned to find a tall man in a sharp suit watching her curiously. He had kind eyes and a faint smile. "Bride?" she lied, her mind racing. "Distant cousin." The man raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I thought I knew all of Sarah's family." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Well, I guess I'm full of surprises." He chuckled. "Fair enough. I'm Ben, Daniel's brother." Her stomach sank. Of all the people she could have run into, why him? She forced a smile. "Nice to meet you. I'm Ellie." Ben studied her for a moment, then nodded. "So, Ellie, what do you think of the happy couple?" "They seem perfect together," she said carefully. Ben's smile faltered. "Yeah, I guess they do." He hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Between you and me, though, something feels off." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Off how?" Ben glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know. Sarah's been acting weird all day and Daniel's been on edge for weeks. It's like they're hiding something." Eleanor's throat went dry. "Do you think they're having second thoughts?" "Maybe." Ben shrugged. "Or maybe they're just nervous. Weddings bring out the best and worst in people." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. Ben didn't know it, but he just confirmed what she already suspected. Something wasn't right. And she was determined to figure out what it was. By the time the reception wound down, Eleanor was no closer to uncovering the full truth. But she'd gathered enough pieces to know one thing. Daniel wasn't the only liar in the room. As guests began to leave, she slipped out to the parking lot. She had just reached her car when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Ben jogging toward her. "Ellie, wait," he called. She frowned. "What is it?" "I know you're not Sarah's cousin," he said, his voice low. Her stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Ben crossed his arms. "I saw you earlier watching Daniel like a hawk. And you didn't show up in any of the family photos. So who are you really?" Eleanor considered lying, but something in Ben's eyes made her hesitate. She sighed. "Fine. I'm Daniel's fiancé." Ben blinked. "Excuse me?" "Well, was his fiancé," she clarified bitterly. "Until I found out he was marrying someone else." Ben stared at her, stunned. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He ran a hand through his hair. This is insane." "Tell me about it," she muttered. For a moment they stood in silence. Then Ben straightened. "You need to tell Sarah." Eleanor shook her head. "She already knows something's wrong. She's hiding something too." Ben frowned. "What do you mean?" "I overheard her on the phone. She hasn't told Daniel something. Something big." Ben's expression darkened. "Then we both need answers." Eleanor hesitated. "You're willing to help me?" He nodded. "If what you're saying is true, then neither of them deserves to walk away from this unscathed." Eleanor wasn't sure why she agreed to let Ben help her. Maybe it was his sincerity, or maybe she just needed someone on her side in this chaos. Either way, they stood in the parking lot, hashing out their plan. "We'll need proof," Ben said. "Something that shows Daniel's been playing both of you." "I have proof," Eleanor replied. "Emails, receipts, dates." "He's sloppy." "Good. But we need more," Ben said. If Sarah's hiding something, we have to find out what it is before we act. How do you suggest we do that? Eleanor asked, crossing her arms. She's not going to just tell us. She might not, but someone else might, Ben said, his eyes narrowing. Sarah's maid of honor, Emma. She knows everything. Eleanor's brow furrowed. How do you know that? Because I've seen them together, Ben explained. They're inseparable. If Sarah has a secret, Emma knows it? Eleanor nodded slowly. Okay. How do we get Emma to talk? Leave that to me, Ben said. You just focus on keeping an eye on Daniel. Eleanor wasn't sure she liked the idea of splitting up, but she didn't have a better plan. Fine. But if you find something, tell me immediately. Deal? Ben said, holding out his hand. Eleanor hesitated, then shook it. Later that night, while most of the guests had gone home or retreated to their hotel rooms, Ben cornered Emma in the lobby. She was seated on a plush couch, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in her hand. Emma, Ben said, taking a seat beside her. Mind if I join you? She glanced at him, surprised, then shrugged. Suit yourself. Ben leaned back, adopting a casual tone. Crazy day, huh? Yeah, Emma said, sipping her wine. Weddings are always chaos. Especially when there are secrets involved, Ben said, watching her closely. Emma froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. What do you mean? I mean Sarah hasn't exactly been herself, Ben said, leaning forward. And you, as her best friend, probably know why. Emma's grip on her glass tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Ben said. Come on, Emma. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to help. If Sarah's in over her head, she needs someone to step in. Emma hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. Finally she sighed. Fine. But you didn't hear this from me? Ben nodded. Of course. Emma lowered her voice. Sarah's pregnant. Ben blinked. What? She found out a month ago, Emma said. She didn't know how to tell Daniel, especially since. She trailed off, looking uneasy. Since what? Ben pressed. Emma bit her lip. Since the baby might not be his. Ben called Eleanor immediately, dragging her out of her hotel room to relay what he'd learned. She listened in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She's pregnant? Eleanor repeated. And it might not be Daniel's? That's what Emma said, Ben confirmed. Apparently she had a thing with someone else before the wedding. Eleanor ran a hand through her hair. This just keeps getting worse. We need to confront them, Ben said. Both of them. Together. Eleanor hesitated. What if Sarah doesn't know about me? What if she's as much a victim as I am? Then she deserves to know the truth, Ben said firmly. And so do you. The dining hall was filled with the clatter of plates and silverware as guests enjoyed breakfast. The sunlight poured through the large windows, casting an almost ethereal glow over Daniel and Sarah as they sat side by side, sharing quiet smiles with their guests. To anyone else they looked like the perfect newlyweds. To Eleanor the sight churned her stomach. Her palms were damp as she approached their table. Ben walked beside her, his jaw tight, a storm brewing behind his calm exterior. As they neared, Eleanor's heartbeat roared in her ears. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and craving all at once. Daniel, Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through the pleasant hum of conversation like a knife. Daniel froze mid-laugh, his fork poised above his plate. Slowly he turned, his face paling when his eyes met hers. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Ellie? What are you? Don't, Eleanor interrupted, her voice cold. Don't act surprised. You know exactly why I'm here. The table fell silent. All eyes were on her now, but Eleanor didn't care. She focused on Daniel, her gaze unwavering. Sarah frowned, glancing between them. Who is she? She asked, her tone sharp with suspicion. Daniel's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find words. Eleanor stepped forward, crossing her arms. Go on, Daniel. Tell her who I am. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Ellie, this isn't the time or place. Oh, I think it's the perfect time, Eleanor shot back. Since we're all about truth and honesty today, why don't we start with this? I'm Eleanor. Daniel's fiancé. Well, was his fiancé until 3 days ago when I found out he was planning a wedding with you. Gasps rippled through the room. Sarah's face drained of color, her hand flying to her mouth. What? It's true, Eleanor said, her voice firm. He proposed to me 6 months ago. We've been planning a wedding. A different wedding. One I didn't know I'd be sharing with you. Sarah turned to Daniel, her voice trembling. Is she telling the truth? Sarah, I can explain, Daniel stammered, reaching for her hand. It's not what it looks like. Don't touch me. Sarah snapped, yanking her hand away. Her voice was rising now, panic and anger lacing her words. How could you do this? How could you? Oh, don't play innocent, Eleanor interrupted, her tone sharp. You've been hiding something too, haven't you? Why don't you tell Daniel about the baby? The color drained from Sarah's face. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even Daniel fell silent, his eyes widening in shock. What baby? He demanded, his voice cracking. Sarah's eyes darted to Eleanor, then back to Daniel. Her lips quivered as she tried to speak. I was going to tell you after the honeymoon, she whispered. I didn't want to ruin the wedding. Ruin the wedding? Daniel's voice was incredulous. Are you kidding me? You've been lying to me this whole time? Sarah's hands shook as she tried to defend herself. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you. Daniel's voice grew louder. And the part about the baby not being mine? Was that just another thing you didn't tell me? Sarah's silence was deafening. Her gaze dropped to the floor, tears brimming in her eyes. The room was deathly still, the air thick with tension. Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the shouting, the humiliation, it was all too much. She turned on her heel and walked away, ignoring the stares of the other guests. Ben followed her, catching up as she stormed out into the crisp morning air. Eleanor, wait, he called, grabbing her arm. She spun around, her chest heaving. What? What do you want, Ben? It's over. I did what I came here to do. You don't have to go through this alone, Ben said softly. I know you're angry and hurt, but you deserve better than to let him destroy you. Eleanor's anger faltered. She searched his face, looking for any trace of pity, but all she saw was understanding. Why do you care? She asked quietly. Because I know what it feels like to be lied to, Ben admitted. Daniel, he's always been like this. Charming but selfish. He doesn't think about the people he hurts. Eleanor's throat tightened. I thought I knew him, she whispered. I thought he loved me. Ben took a step closer. You deserve someone who actually does. Someone who sees you for who you are and doesn't take you for granted. Eleanor blinked back tears. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a chance to start over. Inside the hall, the chaos continued. Daniel and Sarah's argument had escalated, with accusations flying back and forth. Guests whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or leave. Sarah's voice cracked as she shouted, You lied to me, Daniel. You promised me forever, and all the while, you were planning another wedding? And you lied about the baby? Daniel shot back. How am I supposed to believe anything you say? Emma, who had been hovering nearby, finally stepped in. That's enough, she said firmly. You two need to figure this out in private. The guests began to disperse, murmuring quietly as they left the hall. Emma ushered Daniel and Sarah into a side room, their voices still audible through the door. By the time Eleanor returned to her hotel room, she felt emotionally drained but oddly lighter. Ben stayed with her, sitting quietly as she packed her things. So what's next for you? He asked. I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But I'm not going to let this define me. I'll go home, figure out my life and move on. Ben nodded. That sounds like a good plan. But if you need someone to talk to, or help you figure things out. Eleanor looked at him, surprised by the warmth in his voice. She smiled faintly. Thanks, Ben. I might take you up on that. As she zipped up her suitcase, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and walked away stronger. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in days she felt ready to take the first step. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by liking this video, share and subscribe to our channel. Also turn on the post notification bell so that you will be notified each time we post a story.